there's some areas that are similar across grants. And so we'll just sort of go through those more generally, but it'll apply to the F awards, the K awards, the Ts, and different private agencies. And as Katie has here. So yeah. So basically, we'll talk about significance. Innovation is a really key feature. That's a very important component of writing a grant and thinking about what makes it innovative. And it can't just be like, well, no one's done it before, you know, so it's really like thinking about where the gaps are in the field and how your work will advance and address those gaps. And then the importance of pilot data. And then we're going to spend a little time talking about the review process, sort of like what people are looking for, but also what we've seen when we've been doing grant reviews where people have difficulties or get lower scores, to try to help you think through how to attenuate that kind of risk. Okay, next. So as we have here, we're going to be covering not only training grants from NIH, but some of the unique NIH opportunities, and then other opportunities for getting money from foundations and also private foundations or funders. So why would you apply for a training grant? You know, people often think about getting a big research grant like an R01, and that's very, very difficult, obviously, to do. So why would you want a training grant as opposed to a standard research grant? And really what you're thinking about is getting some opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily have. So we all have opportunities available to us through our graduate training or our postdocs. So this is an option where there's training that you would not be able to get in the settings that you already are in. We want to get additional mentoring and consultation, again, beyond what's already available to you. And you also want to have protected time. So you'll know that if you're doing clinical work or you're teaching, that you want to be able to kind of save up some time that you can use to focus on your research. And certainly this will be linked to career advancement. People want to see if you're getting promoted or you're looking for jobs, that you're able to get funding. And it's a very, very difficult climate to do that. So if you can demonstrate that you're able to, that can really help you in the job market. So we'll talk about the different series for NIH. So there's a T series, the F series, the K series. Katie will talk about the R series, National Science Foundation, and then also private agencies.
And I'll mention here, we probably won't actually have much time to talk a whole lot about NSF today.
Right.
The bulk of the money that is available typically for psychologists will, and likely for you as someone who's interested in child and adolescent psychopathology, your best bet is probably going to be NIH for most of those grant opportunities.
So the T series, this isn't something that you would necessarily apply for, but it's something that you would want to look out for with postdocs. And the T32 would be an Institutional National Research Service Award. That's what NRSA is. And basically that's like a center grant or a grant that provides support for trainees. So when you're applying for postdocs, this would be something that you would want to be on the lookout for. If they have these kinds of T-series available, then that would provide funding for you. And for those of you who are thinking about doing postdocs, you'll see that you might apply to work with somebody and they don't have the funding for it. So if they have a T grant, then they would be able to provide support for a couple years for that.
And we'll put online some instructions for how you can search for the T32 opportunities that are out there. Sometimes they're well advertised, sometimes they're kind of hidden. So this on the right-hand side, this is just an example of a basic description of one that's currently available and relevant for some of you. But we'll provide more info on how to find these opportunities.
Okay, so we'll start then with the F series, and basically we're looking at either F31, which would be pre-doctoral fellowship, or F32, which would be a postdoctoral fellowship. So In terms of the anatomy of these F series, they're similar. And really what you're doing is just thinking about your timing in terms of your training. And as we have there, you know, it's really, they both provide that additional training that would be something that you wouldn't get at your home institution. Okay. So there's some basic areas, and we're going to go through these pieces quickly, and then we're going to focus more on the areas that get scored and that are really important in terms of getting your funding. So we have our project summary and abstract. The project narrative is like, you know, if you get the grant, this is like what NIH would put on their website. Like, these are the kinds of things that we fund. So this is what I say, like, if you're going to tell your mom what you're studying, that's what the project narrative looks like. You have your bibliography and references, facilities and other resources, and equipment. So these are just sort of like, if you're at a good institution, there's going to be some boilerplate material that you can use for those sections, but they just want to make sure that you're in a setting that's going to support your research. Because sometimes people are applying and the candidate looks amazing, but they're in a place that it's not a Research One institution, or they might not be able to get the support that they need to do the research. So facilities and other resources are important for your setting in particular. In terms of the research and related people that you're going to have involved, naturally you would have your mentor or whoever's hired you for your postdoc. They all provide bio sketches. I guess it was probably like 6 or 7 years ago, they started adding the section A, which is, because people would just like have, it's like your CV. Like, can I have your CV? It's like, yep, I'll give it to you right now. And so section A is really very specific to that particular grant. So when I review grants and people say, you know, I'm world known for doing these important things, and I've published this many papers and I've had a lot of funding, and I'm like, great, but I'm not giving you the grant. I'm trying to give a student the grant to know that this person who's so famous is actually going to help them. So section A needs to be, I have this expertise and I'll bring it to help this person advance their career and be very specific about the type of support the person will provide. We give low scores when we see things like, you know, I'm very famous and I've mentored all these students. And then when I'm reviewing, I start thinking, is this person going to have the time to actually do what they need to do for the students? And then you'll have letters of support from consultants. Same thing. I'm going to meet with them once a month via Zoom, whatever, and we're going to talk about readings, and I'm going to review their papers. We want everything to be very, very specific, not just, I care about this person, I'm going to help them. We want to know specifically, what are you committing to? So details are very, very important in both section A, the bio sketch, and in the letters of support. In terms of the background and goals for the fellowship training, this is incredibly important. You want to demonstrate your trajectory. So this is what I did as an undergrad, this is what I did post-bac, this is what I've been doing in graduate school, so that you're telling a story. So a lot of times when we look back, we're like, yeah, I worked with kids. For me, like, I was in family court, I worked with kids with epilepsy, you know, I care about conduct problems. You want a coherent narrative. This is something you just want to be working on in general for the job market, you know, where you have a research statement where you're tracing what you got interested in, and it's very much about process. For those of you in clinical, this is also what you're going to do for your internship essays. It's about process. And it's like, I did this, and then I got interested in this other thing, and now I did this next line of inquiry, so that you're tracing your developmental trajectory in terms of your interests. Specific aims, this is going to be the same thing across the F awards, the K awards, the R, one page where you're giving the background and then what your objectives are. In terms of the research strategy, we have these very important parts with the significance. Again, why is this important? Why is it innovative? How is this going to make a difference in terms of our knowledge, in terms of clinical implications, in terms of moving forward with the field? You really want to have some kind of pilot data to demonstrate feasibility. And then we're going to be looking at the method also. You know, what is your strategy? Is this feasible? These grants are only 2 years. So a lot of times people say, you know, and it's usually like your dissertation or something that's an offshoot from your dissertation if it's an F32. but with the method, you want to demonstrate feasibility. So having pilot data is a good way to do that, or demonstrate you already know these methods and you'll be able to use them in during the grant period. And then in terms of respective contributions, again, this is tricky, but this goes back to your letters, your consultant letters, and also, like I said, section A of your bio sketch, where you want to be able to say, person A is going to give me training in EEG. Person B is going to give me support regarding stats, so that there isn't overlap, but each person is making a unique contribution that dovetails with your long-term goals.
And Deb, you've reviewed a lot of these. Would you say that with the respective contributions, you also want the applicant to highlight how what they're contributing is different from what the lab PI was probably already planning to do?
That's exactly right. I think that's probably my biggest criticism when I look at respective contributions. People will say things like, well, if I can just focus on my research now to be a TA, then I can like do more work in my lab. So I saw like Leslie Norris is on, and she works with Phil Kendall. So she just said, I'm going to keep doing child anxiety treatment. I'd be like, well, you already get that from Phil. Like, why would you keep doing that? Like, what's going to be different? So it might be learning like ecological momentary assessment, to track kids' anxiety. So there's going to be something different in terms of the strategies that you're learning, whether it's methodological or statistical. Okay. So we can actually kind of go through this quickly. We already talked about the selection of sponsor and institution. That's like where you are already, and that you're demonstrating that this is an institution that supports research. You also want to make sure that you're talking about responsible conduct of research. So this is not just like the city training that we all get. It's also, you would say, and when I'm meeting with my mentor every week, we're going to talk about ethical issues. I'm going to take online courses. So it has to go beyond what's business as usual, if you will. In the sponsor and co-sponsor statements, we want to see that this is someone who knows how to mentor, who's been successful with mentoring. People list where their former students have gone, what kinds of jobs they've got. And we want to see that the sponsor has a trajectory where they've been able to do a good job with training individuals to become independent researchers. I mentioned the letters of support already, and certainly with the institutional environment, again, you'll have some boilerplate material for that, but it's really making sure that the setting will be supportive of the research. So sometimes people say, I'm going to collect data on 100 people and I'm going to go out in the community. Well, we're going to be worried about you getting that done in 2 years. So we want to make sure that the institutional environment will provide funding and infrastructure support to make sure that your research project is actually feasible. Okay. And then these are just some other areas that you're going to have in your in the grant that we don't have to spend too much time on. Okay. So then getting to a K award, this would be postdoc, maybe moving into, I had a K award when I was at Temple. I didn't have funding before that, so it didn't make sense for me to get an R. Like I went for career development award. So the K01 is the mentored research scientist. K23 is more patient-oriented. So this be like if you're in a medical setting, for example. And then a relatively newer K award is the K99R00. They call it kangaroo just because of the way that it looks. But this is like you get the K award, but then you're also going to be doing your independent research. This is terrific if you're going from a postdoc into an academic position. If you have one of these, believe me, at Temple, when we see this, we're like, you could be like the biggest jerk on the planet, but you have this grant? Like, all right, good. Bring us that money. Like, that sounds good. But it's really, you're going to get the training. And then the second piece in the mechanism is that you're doing your own independent work. So the K01 is harder to go to an R, but with the K99, if you're able to get that, then you're going to be doing your independent research on the second half of the grant. Okay. So in terms of the candidate information, we have our normal background that I was talking about with the F award, that it's, you're trajectory. What did you do? I mean, I started, like I talked about my undergraduate experiences, even though I was already faculty when I wrote this. Again, you want to have this, I've loved research my whole life and I still love it and I'm going to keep working hard at it. And so that's really the story that you want to be able to tell. Goals and objectives, like we talked about with the F award. And then you want to have this professional development training plan. So it's really like, what are you going to do? How will this build on the experiences that you already have? So for example, with my K award, I wanted to get more information about like biostatistics and neuroscience. So I'm a developmental psychopathologist by training. So I knew tons about clinical and developmental. So in my background, I said, here are all the things that I know already, but I'm very interested in neurodevelopmental factors, and I don't know that much about it. So I want to learn about neuroscience. I didn't say I want to learn how to do fMRI. That would have been unreasonable to do in a K award when I have no experience with it. But I said, I'll take classes. I'll work with people that do fMRI. You're not expected to be an expert in everything. So with this, it's really linking yourself up with people that are experts that can help you critically evaluate the literature, understand it in a way that that can inform your own independent work. So again, we have our specific aims. It's just going to be one page. Our research strategy, again, the significance. Why does this matter? Why should reviewers and funding agencies care about it? Innovation, again, is incredibly important. Again, it can't just be, well, no one's done this before. You know, it's really, why will this change the field? And again, to use a Phil Kendall expression, he always says, like, what's the next needed study? You don't want it to be something that no one's ever done before. And you're like, and I'm going to change the methods, and I'm going to use different samples, and I'm going to look at it during different developmental periods, because then we don't know how your findings map onto the existing literature. So we want it to be innovative where it's different in terms of methods and it's building on the literature. But that significance section is incredibly important for having the reviewer understand how what you're doing is going to build on the framework that's already existing and the gaps that it's going to fill. And then with the candidate information, that's your background and your research strategy. It's only going to be 12 pages. And both of those pieces are really important. So you might think, well, I just really want to talk about the research I'm going to do. Well, they're buying you in this situation. It's not an R where they just care about the research strategy. You really want to have a nice, tight framing of why this is going to help you to become an independent scientist and why you need a K award in particular. And then these other sections, I think, Katie, we can just skip through this that we have. Yeah, thanks. Mm-hmm. That's fine. And so in terms of telling your story, you're obviously going to be building on your graduate school focus. So you're going to have this nice narrative. This is what I learned. This is what I did my dissertation on. This is what I care about moving forward. But I think my training, and you don't want to badmouth your graduate training, right? So you'd be like, I learned all these things and it was so amazing in graduate school. But, you know, I didn't quite have enough time to learn about, longitudinal modeling or person-centered analyses. And these are things that are going to really help me, and here's why. So you're framing it based on what you already know. You're demonstrating that, like, you killed it in school, you were awesome, but like you just didn't have those opportunities. So the second point that we have here, it's like, what do you know? What do you need to transform your research? So we often, and Katie and I were talking about this yesterday, we're often very self-effacing, and we'll say like, oh, well, I was just around smart people and I got lucky. I worked in a really good lab and, oh, shucks, I hope that like I can go to this stats workshop. But you really want to be saying like, look, I'm really, really invested in research. Here are all the things I've done. Here are the publications I have. Here are the areas that I'm very invested in. And if I could just get this other training, then I can like change the world. And it's a really different way of thinking. And this is why you really want other people reviewing your grants and giving you feedback, because it's very hard for us to talk about ourselves that way. And so we want, as reviewers, to see this is someone that has a demonstrated track record and interest, whether it's presenting at conferences or publications. We don't expect people to have tons of publications, but we want to know that this is someone that's invested in research. So the third bullet, what's important in the field, it's not just necessarily what's getting funded, but also, where is the field going? And so even talking to mentors and other people that are more senior in the field, they'll have a handle on what areas are sort of, hot topics, if you will. So you're trying to extend to a new area, and being very specific about what the methods are that you're going to learn. And so there are two pieces. One is, how is this going to help you? But also, how is it going to help the field? And you want to make sure that everything you're writing addresses both of those aspects. So basically, when you're writing your research statement, you'll have some areas that logically flow from what you did as a graduate student. So one area will be like what you studied in graduate school or on your postdoc. And then you want to have something that dovetails with it. So it could be you're interested. So for me, it was like, I'm very interested in co-occurring conduct problems and depression. So I had a line of research where I looked at conduct problems, and I had some stuff looking at comorbidity. But I said, I think that there's some shared processes that I could better understand if I knew more about neuroscience. And I understand that comorbidities can develop over time. So I want to learn more about statistics that can help me do perspective modeling or look at person-centered analyses. So you can have your 2 lines of research, and then one is going to be, this is what I've been doing, but this is the direction I want to go in. Again, you're considering the existing literature. And when you're writing a grant, you really want to make sure that you're not just writing for NIH. So when you're thinking about these 2 lines of research, ideally, this would be something that you could submit to other agencies. And we know that there are differences in funding priorities and availability. So once you've written this grant, then it's going to be things, Andy often talks about like his grants as being like Frankenstein, where it's sort of like he's just pieced different grants together, and he's like, all right, this one's going to NIH, this one's going to NSF, and that you have these different components that you can then put together for a grant down the road. For those of you who are publishing in graduate school, you know that you don't publish on different topics. Everything is like, all right, well, I have my literature review from this. Now I'm going to tweak it a little bit. Now I'm going to look at these other variables. And that's what helps us to have this programmatic work where we can say, my publications or my presentations fall into this one particular line of research. And so these are just some trends that Katie and I identified that we just wanted to share with you. So, we used to have with RDoC, the research domain criteria, that's what NIH was funding, and everybody was looking at transdiagnostic phenomena. And, there isn't so much support for that, but certainly like with brain genetics research, people are very interested in funding that. Not genetic polymorphism, more the genome-wide association study research is getting funded. For me, I'm interested in risk, and I'm not going to go into a low-income urban school and get genetic data from everybody. So I might say, all right, we're going to use laboratory-based tasks that have been shown to recruit the limbic system, which I know is overactive among low-income urban kids. So it doesn't have to be fMRI or genetic research. It could be that you're looking at endophenotypes, like markers of genetic polymorphisms or genetic risk that will help us to better identify those at risk when we have limited resources or those that might benefit differentially from interventions. We know one size doesn't fit all. So when we're thinking about brain genetics research, again, there are a lot of different methods where you can be talking about those systems that might be implicated. Dissemination, implementation, we're thinking about effectiveness. That's another really hot topic where, we're taking research that's been done in the lab where it's been shown to be efficacious, works under very controlled circumstances, and then figuring out how do we adapt it in the community to make sure that evidence-based interventions are being utilized in the school setting in community mental health centers. And then with stats, we have some examples there, and really thinking about whether people are still focused on disorders versus taking more of a developmental psychopathology perspective, where we're looking at dimensions, thinking about risk and resilience, and also positive adjustment, looking at the nexus between physical health and psychological health. And in terms of thinking about what do you need to operate more independently, it's really thinking about those kinds of trainings that you could fold into your training plan.
Okay. Well, so that was a great overview that Deb just gave on various,
Thanks, Katie.
yeah, on various training-related grant opportunities that NIH provides. And those grants are great whether you're at the beginning of your grad school training or getting towards the end and thinking about postdoctoral training. Some of you may be at the later stages of your graduate training or already in a postdoc, and you might be thinking about transitioning to a faculty position. And when you are at that chapter of your career, it's a good time to start thinking about standard NIH grant opportunities. And so the next couple of slides are going to be an overview of sort of what the main players are and sort of some pros and cons of each. So I have this ordered in terms of small to large. So the R03 is one of the smaller grants that NIH offers. You get $50,000 for each of 2 years. So depending on the work that you're doing, that either is a lot of money to do your science or not very much money at all. That might sound like a lot of money, but if you are paying for salaries or staffing, that money goes really fast. And so increasingly, I have seen colleagues using the R03 mechanism as an opportunity to code existing data, to reanalyze large data sets, maybe tack on a small pilot study in addition to some secondary data analysis. So that, like I said, that money goes fast. So one of the things that reviewers will be looking for is to make sure you can actually do your work with that small budget. One of the advantages here is that your research strategy is only 6 pages. So you really are sort of describing your problem, explaining your methods, and how you're going to do it. There's not a lot to say. One drawback of this approach is that there are no cost extensions allowed. And this is an issue because you get those 2 years of funding and then the money goes away. So if you are thrifty, that's great, but that means you're going to be giving money back to NIH, and you never want to have to do that. So the next opportunity that you might want to consider is called an R21. This is also a 2-year grant mechanism, but as you can see here, it is almost 3 times the size of funding. So you're going to have up to $275,000 total. And it's a modular budget that they request, so you don't need to itemize everything that you're going to be putting together. R21s used to be called high risk, high reward, or high risk something. They had a catchy term for it, but now they're really more framed in terms of exploratory or developmental projects. So you might have an idea that is just really untested and you maybe don't have a lot of pilot data, and this is gathering the preliminary data that you might want to then eventually write an R01, which would be a much larger project. Like the R03, you are capped at 6 pages for your research strategy. So again, you're really just kind of giving bare bones description of your project and hopefully planting the seeds for why you need this amount of money to do your project. And then probably what you have heard other faculty talk about is the R01. This is kind of the main player in large grant project opportunities at NIH. The size and length of the grant will vary depending on your needs. Generally, these are grants that last between 3 and 5 years. People often write them to be 5 years, and sometimes NIH will come back and say, we'll give you 4 years. And typically you're going to be asking for less than $500,000 per year. Most people are generally not ready to write an R01 right out of the gate. You need to have some preliminary data. And so if you are in, transitioning into a faculty role, those first couple of years, hopefully you have some seed grant money or startup money, and you can use that money to get the preliminary data together that you would need to then be able to put an R01 together afterwards. So a much larger project, you have double the space to talk about what you want to do in your study, but the expectations are much higher in terms of what the scope of your project will be and what the contribution to science will be as well. So the advice I got was typically don't start straight with an R01, but there's a lot of conflicting advice out there because, as you can see with the R03 and the R21, it's a much smaller pool of money, and they tend to be oftentimes just as competitive in terms of percentages that get funded every year. So some people just say, like, just start writing R01s because you never know, you might get lucky.
And Katie will talk about like how to find funding opportunities, but they do have R01s that are also secondary data analysis of existing data. And I've certainly written some of those because NIH has funded these very, very large projects, and they're like, all right, there are all these existing data and no one is analyzing it. The PIs have moved on to other projects, so they'll actually provide funding also for using existing data, which isn't the worst idea right now with the way the world is, that we're not able to go out and like collect new data. So there are some potential opportunities even for the R01 with the existing data.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And in fact, like Deb said, those large data sets are often completely ignored once the study is done. So there's really great mining that can be done, and oftentimes huge sample sizes and really interesting measures. So yeah, that's definitely worth considering. Just a quick note about those 3 different R series grant opportunities. Your average person who says, I'm writing an R01 right now, is most likely submitting what we refer to as an unsolicited or investigator-initiated proposal. That just means they had an idea and they want to write about it, and they're going to submit that to NIH. However, NIH also has requests for applications, and they also call them funding opportunity announcements. These are rotating calls with very specific study topics in mind. So I'll show you an example in a minute, but you can search in their database to find out what is a funding opportunity, and are any of the topics that I study something that NIH is specifically saying, hey, we want to fund this, we're going to fund 20 proposals on, topic XYZ. And that can be a really great opportunity, especially if not a lot of people are applying through those FOAs. So just to give you an example here, just the other day, I did a search on sleep disparities. So I'm a sort of developmental health psychologist, and I do not currently study sleep, but I'm interested in it. And it turns out just back in April, they initiated this focus on mechanisms and consequences of sleep disparities in the US. And here's an example of some of the FOAs that came up when I just searched for sleep disparities. And so I clicked on that first one in this title, in this chart here. And a couple of things I wanted to point out. So you might say like, oh, I study sleep disparities. This is awesome. And it probably is. But one of the big things that you need to look at when you are looking for these specific calls is who is participating in the FOA. And when I say who, what I'm talking about is which of the NIH institutes are participating. And so here you can see that there's only a handful of institutes who are considering this call. And what should be probably obvious here is that you notice that both NIMH and NICHD, which are probably the 2 main players that many of you would be thinking of for possible funders of your work, they're not participating in this call. Now that could be okay, but but you have to consider who your audience is when you're writing your proposal. So if you just say, I'm interested in kids and sleep disparities and how race plays a role in children not getting enough sleep because they have longer commutes to school and more stressors at home, that would be a project that NICHD would probably care a lot about. But you have to think about who of this list is going to care and why they're going to care. So maybe NIMHD would take on that kind of project, but it's all about framing. So what is your story, and making sure that the buzzwords that you're using, the measures that you're using, tie into outcomes that one of these institutes is going to care about. That's sort of a lot of info, but hopefully that makes sense just in terms of knowing your audience. I'm happy to answer any questions if that wasn't clear.
We do have a question that I got in the chat, and it's asking about what you recommend in terms of a timeline or progression for submitting training grants. So for example, like would an F31 be more mid-grad school? Maybe a T31, T32 would be last year of grad school, and then something like a K99 or R would be like last year of postdoc. So just curious sort of about the general guidelines you would offer for like when to submit.
Yeah, so the F31 is generally funding someone's dissertation. So that would be something you would apply for maybe like in your third year. Each grant only allows for one revision. So when you submit a grant, so like I have grants to review this weekend for a panel in like 10 days, but those grants were probably submitted like 4 months ago. So we'll review it, then people get feedback in like a month. And then if they're going to get funded, then people will know in about 6 or 7 months altogether from when you submit it. So if you submit in your third year, you'll know towards like about 6 months later, you'll do a revision, and the deadlines are like 3 times a year. So then you'll submit the revision, and then you would have the funding presumably for the beginning of maybe your 4th or 5th year of graduate school. When you're thinking about a postdoc, often people will write the F32 before they even start the postdoc, or they'll write it as soon as they get to their postdoc. And that might seem artificial because it's like you're talking about the training you're going to get and you haven't even started it, but you know what you can expect. So that would be something that you would start at the beginning of your postdoc, or again, sometimes people write it before they even start their postdocs. I think that's a little too early because you don't have the relationship established with your mentor yet. And so we worry about that when we're reviewing it. Then the K award would be more towards the end of your postdoc going into your next job. So whether it's an academic job or some other kind of research-based job, that's when I would expect to see that.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's really never too early to get started. These grants always take much longer than you think they will to put together. And if you are assuming you're going to need to revise, you know, you'll get a score, but it's not good enough to get funded. And so building in that additional 4 to 5 months for a revision might be important, just to make sure you still have the time, whether it's during grad school or during postdoc, to you know, to actually do the work that you propose doing. So, and as far as F32s go, which would be funding your postdoc time, what I did and what I would recommend as well for you all is to reach out to possible postdoc mentors while you're still in grad school, because they might have funding to tie you for the first year, and then you write a grant that would support you for longer. And so you could potentially get started writing that application. You know, what I did was I was moving to my postdoc and writing my application just to give myself enough time. So, and please, I would be interested in doing that as well if anybody is looking for a postdoc. So.
And then one more question while we're on this topic. Some attendees are wondering, does this timeline apply similarly for students in a clinical program and a non-clinical program? For example, like the two of you are, you know, coming from different training areas in psychology.
Yes, I would say it's the same. Absolutely. So I think what's tricky with the clinical internship is just that the person generally needs to be done with their F31 before they start internship, but people continue data collection, or there might be, you know, less senior students in the lab that continue with the data collection, and people defend their dissertations while they're on internship. But it's similar in terms of the timing.
Great. All right, well, we're going to transition now to talking a little bit about what makes a successful application. I'm just looking at the time. We have about 15 minutes left. Is that right? What time do we end this
I think
session?
we're till 10:30. Is that right, Bridget?
Yep, we're until 10:30, and we'll
Okay, so we got half an hour.
like
Perfect.
5 to 10 minutes for questions.
Great. All right.
Okay, so in terms of the preliminary data and the track record, we've already touched on this. But basically, the importance of the preliminary data is that it's more like a proof of concept, that you're demonstrating, I can actually do this study. If you give me money, like, look, I got 10 people, I'm showing that this procedure works, and I have in terms of the direction of effects, this is like what I would have hypothesized, but I want to get 100 people. So I'm going to show you that I'm able to recruit this particular sample, to use these particular methods to demonstrate an effect that is consistent with what we would want. With training grants, people will say, like, I'm going to get 100 participants. I'm like, no, you're not. You know, you need to, like, go to your classes and, you know, do your workshops. And one of the adjectives that I use that you don't want to see in your review process is, this grant is too ambitious. It means, like, look, I know there are only so many hours in a day, and you're not getting all that stuff done in 2 years. So with the preliminary data, with the research project, you're just saying, look, I can get this done. And if I have protected time, or if I'm able to hire staff with this grant, then I could definitely get this done and, you know, move the field forward in the particular areas that I want to study. In terms of pilot projects, you know, you want to demonstrate, you don't want to do the whole study. Sometimes people will be like, well, we already got 50 people and we showed that it works and we want 10 more. It's like, all right, well, just keep doing your work then. I'm not giving you money for that. So you really want to make sure that you have, like, the right balance, where it's like, oh, if only I had this grant, I could change the world. You know, so you want to make sure, again, that you've demonstrated feasibility with that. You also want to demonstrate feasibility for you, you know, that you've shown that you've published in these areas, that you've thought deeply about this. One of the criticisms that I got on one of my recent grants, I was talking about extending my work to look at genome-wide association studies, and I don't know that much about genetics, and my co-investigators who were too busy to help me with the grant. So, you know, so I did my best. And I think that, like, if somebody who doesn't know genetics read it, would probably be like, oh, this really makes sense. This sounds great. But in terms of the preliminary data and demonstrating your track record, when they read it, they're like, yeah, she knows a lot about comorbidity and conduct problems and context and stats, but I'm reading this genetic section and it doesn't seem like anybody actually looked at this or helped her with it. And so you won't get something funded with that. And I'll see that with F awards when I'm reviewing them, that I'll give feedback on the first version and I'm like, you need to do a power analysis. And people will just put in, they're looking at moderation or something, or they're doing person-centered analyses, and they'll just use G power. And I'm like, okay, seems like you need a stats consultant because this isn't getting it done. This isn't the right strategy. And the person will add a stats consultant, but that section will still be the same. So they'll get a lower score for their sponsors and collaborators from me, because I know people aren't providing the support and training that they need. So part of the pilot project is also to demonstrate that you have sufficient knowledge to be able to do what you're saying that you're going to do. And so, you know, we have something about, you know, the small open trials, that might be sufficient, just again, to demonstrate the feasibility. And you want to make sure that you're demonstrating innovation with the pilot data, that it's not just, again, business as usual, that you're actually advancing the field with the approach that you're taking. Okay. So when we're saying you want to demonstrate a track record, again, there's that balance. You don't want to say, I've already done all of this, I want to keep going, and I just want summer salary. It's really like, well, how is this going to build on what you've done? Obviously, you're not going to be an expert in everything, and you want to have good collaborators. So for my example with the genetics, they were thinking like her collaborators don't have her back on this, and so like we don't want to give it a good score. My colleague at Temple just got a couple R01s, and we've worked together, we've published together, we have a long-standing relationship. So when I say I'm going to provide stat support on this project, I have my own track record of it, and we have a history of collaboration. So we want to see those kinds of things in terms of believing that the track record even of collaboration is going to be useful and feasible. You want to demonstrate with your collaborators that you have published with them, and you want to show that you have some publications that are relevant to the area. So it could be that you're expanding in terms of methods, but that substantively or in terms of your conceptual model or your programmatic research, that the grant you're writing dovetails with that. And in terms of again, with the reviewers, they want to consider feasibility, and basically you want to show that you can pull off what you're saying. So if you've never done an intervention before and you're saying, okay, I've done all this risk and resilience research, and now I'm going to use the variables that I assessed in a new study, and then I'm going to provide an intervention. You want to make sure that you have a collaborator who is demonstrate that they can do the interventions, for example. So in terms of picking a team, so whether it's collaborators on your R award or sponsors on a K or F award, you really want to know what your story is before you think about the team. You want to know, like, what do I already have in terms of my requisite knowledge and experience? What does my mentor, my current collaborator have? And then who do I need to fill in this other area that might be useful to demonstrate the feasibility? So in terms of considerations for who might go on your team, are there any new constructs that you're going to be studying that maybe you haven't before? So again, in my case, if I'm thinking about genetics, or when I'm collaborating with other people, I might be bringing expertise in development or in contextual factors. Are you using new assessments or measurements? So there's the conceptual piece, your construct, and then how you're indexing it in terms of your methods or your stats. Do you need somebody to help you with that to demonstrate you can do it? Do you need someone who's more senior, who's demonstrated that they can do this work if you're trying to move in a new direction? Do you need people in new settings? So when I do school-based research, which is mostly what I do, you know, I have letters from the principal saying, we've been working with Deb for 10 years. We're going to continue working with her. We're very excited about this project. So just demonstrating, even though that person might not be a co-investigator, but demonstrating that you have support for the other settings. And then stats is always a big one. They want to make sure that you are going to be able to analyze those data that you collect. So what's the team going to do besides, you know, get money budgeted to them? So that's going to be very different across institutions and individuals. You want to work all that out in advance. You want to be super, super specific in the collaborator letters and what each respective contribution is going to be. Sometimes with the grants, you might bring a senior person in just to read or edit the proposal, someone that's been doing this for a while, or in my case, I've been reviewing for a while, that I give a lot of our students at Temple. I'll read their proposals and give them feedback on their training plans, for example. I'm not involved in the grant. It's just I want the student to get the grant, and they never say thank you. It's really, no. So, but it's sort of like if someone knows what's happening in the field, and then they can look at it for you and be like, this doesn't seem feasible. This is too much of a leap from what you've already done. They can help you think who is going to be useful for your team to demonstrate that feasibility. And then sometimes you actually want that person to be a consultant, you know, that they're going to help you with the section. And then when you're choosing your collaborators, you might put somebody on the grant that's super famous, But if that person is known for not doing very much, and there are people, it's remarkable how small the research world is. But when I see that someone will put a letter in where they'll say like, I'm going to devote 10 hours a week to this project, I'm like, you know what? You're on 75 other projects and there just isn't enough time. So when you're choosing collaborators, you want to make sure that it's actually, again, feasible, and that this is a person that can give you that time, that you have an established relationship with, that you've demonstrated a good working relationship with already. Do you want to do this part, Katie?
Sure. So, you know, budgets are tricky. Fortunately, when it comes to most of the, well, at least some of the training grants, so the Fs, the Ts, I guess probably not the Ks, you actually don't need to worry about the budget at all. It's a set amount. They give the same amount to everybody. And so you can skip all of this. But when you get into the K awards and then the R, the regular series grants, you need to consider a lot of factors simultaneously. So some issues that you need to think about is how much your personnel costs are going to be. That is absolutely the case, that it's almost always your largest cost, partly for salary, but then fringe benefits as well that you'll be paying for people's insurance and stuff like that. So you need to weigh how expensive your various co-investigators might be, and also how expensive your project itself is going to be. So if you have neuroimaging costs, for instance, that could be $600, $1,000 per hour of scanning time, which can add up fast. So you sort of need to do a little bit, it's almost like a puzzle where you're sort of fitting in what are fixed costs that you're not going to be able to compromise on, and what are things that are a little bit more flexible. So for instance, maybe I really want this person to be a co-PI, which would mean they would be really supporting the project and partnering with you. That's going to be higher personnel costs, but maybe I can actually do it mostly with myself, and I can just have them on as a co-investigator, so they'd have a smaller percentage of time on the grant. And so you can save on your personnel costs there. Deb's note about sort of how do you make these decisions about consultant versus co-investigator really comes down to how many hours total do you think you're going to be relying on somebody. So, you know, a good metric is if it's really, you're talking more a few phone calls, help with occasional question and answer. A consultant is probably a better role for somebody than an actual co-investigator who would be at the level of helping you with measures and solving logistics challenges and that sort of thing.
Katie, I'm just going to interrupt very quickly. With the amount of money, so if you have someone that has a really high salary, you could always just give them a set amount of money per year, as opposed to saying like 10% of their salary. And so it really goes based on the effort. But there are ways around that if the person's going to be too expensive, or you can just give them like a flat rate.
Interesting. And would they be a consultant at that point, or they could be on
They'll be a co-investigator. So it's really more about, sorry, I was reading Bridget's email. So it really just depends how you want to budget something out. So if you're doing like a K award and you only have $50,000 to work with per year, then that person, you might just say like, I'm going to give you $2,000 a year to consult on this, or to be a mentor. But the budget, those numbers are going to be separate from what they're saying they're going to do.
Okay, gotcha. This is just some more about budgets. You probably need to support your grad students if you have them, full-time project coordinators as well. For some of you who have been project coordinators, you will remember that your salary was very tiny. But what you might not be thinking about is the fringe that gets added into a grant. So for instance, if you have a project coordinator making $30,000 a year, at UGA, the fringe benefit rate is 72% for that salary. So your actual line item cost in the grant is over $50,000 for that one person.
And it's the same thing with our graduate students, that if I wanted to hire a full-time coordinator at, you know, like $50,000, that person would work 40 hours a week. Our graduate students only work 20 hours a week, but they still cost $50,000 because of the stipend, the fringe, their tuition. So, you know, so when you're figuring out, it's like, how much time do you need? But certainly, like, I know at least at Temple, we're always going to fund graduate students before we go for project coordinators.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this is, you know, on this slide is just some additional notes about sort of how those costs really get amplified. You know, so a junior faculty making closer to $90,000 a year, their 10% effort looks a lot different than a super senior person with a, you know, $200,000 salary. Their 10% effort is over double, plus the fringe rate. So we also are often encouraged to start getting our summer salary supported. So for many of you, when you transition to faculty positions, you'll actually be on a 9-month contract, which means that you have 3 months of summer that you could potentially get funded on your grants, and make considerably more money. So those are just some decisions to weigh about paying yourself in the summer versus buying out of teaching, which institutions will vary on how much they'll let you get out of your teaching obligations so that you can focus on your science. But those are some important factors to consider.
And I know, like at Temple, our course buyout, it cost 1/9 of our salary. So if I'm, you know, making $90,000, then it would cost $10,000. And so for people that make a lot of money, they want people to take the course buyout because they're not using the $10,000 to pay somebody. They're paying the person $4,000 for teaching. So the department gets $6K if someone's buying out. So, and if you're tenure track, you don't want to buy out too much because you want to demonstrate your teaching record when you're going up for a promotion, for example.
Yeah, and I know we're probably getting a little bit into the weeds for some
Yeah.
of you, so we're happy to follow up if anybody has specific questions about any of these details later. I didn't learn this until I was a faculty member, so this is just for those of you who aren't yet in a faculty position. This is sort of like the behind the scenes pieces that you will be confronting. So, all right, so we've been talking a lot about NIH, but there are a lot of other places that you can be looking for money. Here are just a few examples. IES funds work that often has an educational focus. SAMHSA will fund substance abuse and mental health, or yeah, okay. NSF typically funds basic science research projects. So if your work naturally has an applied spin or some sort of health relevance, it can be very difficult to get funding from NSF. I don't know, PCORI, what is that?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, and then there are a number of private foundations that have a huge invested stake in supporting research, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But I will say I have signed in blood that I will always talk a little bit about some unique opportunities that NIH offers. So everything we've been talking about before up until now has been thinking about directing your work to one of the 30-some institutes that are under the umbrella of NIH. But NIH also has what they call the Common Fund that supports creative research projects that don't necessarily fit under one institute's umbrella. And these are the 4 awards that are offered currently as part of the high risk, high reward opportunity. 2 of these awards are more appropriate for early career researchers than others. So I will just give you the 30-second spiel on each of these. The Early Independence Award is for people who are looking to skip a traditional postdoc and move into a faculty position. Although I think you actually can still do a postdoc under this award. Jessica Schleider, who is part of the development program with this conference, currently has one of these, so you can ask her for her experience applying. It is a very narrow window when you are eligible, but what you can see here is that you get a lot of money. It's close, sort of on the spectrum of an R01 in terms of direct costs per year. No preliminary data is required, and they really mean that. This is really for people who they understand. You haven't had years, managing a research lab to build up the preliminary data. And there's a limited number of people that can apply per institution. So you need to be in touch with the grants office at your university to see, they might actually have an internal competition to figure out who will go forward with the application. The other one that I will mention is one that I applied for my second or third year here at UGA. This is called the New Innovator Award. You have to have early stage investigator status at NIH, which means that you are within 10 years of your last training and that you have not had an R01 up until that point. No other collaborators are allowed on the grant, so that's something to consider if you have any obligations to work with other co-PIs. Again, no preliminary data required, and you get a lot of money all in the first year. So that gives you tremendous flexibility in terms of when you might be incurring costs. And there are also expectations for how much time you will devote to the research project. But it gives you a lot of flexibility. I'm happy to share my materials and experience. And I will just say, because I'm a social scientist and they fund very few of them, but it's because I think most social scientists are not applying. I'm always getting emails with requests for encouraging people to apply to this program. So it's a very competitive, but it's a really unique experience, and I'd love to talk more about it later. So that is my spiel on that. But now we'll talk briefly about some private foundations that might be worth checking out. They are quite different in terms of the applications and the expectations typically that come with getting funding from private foundations. Often, but not always, you actually have a little bit more flexibility with what you want to do. But as you will talk about here, there's typically also much smaller grant dollars that we're talking about as well. One opportunity that I know many former Future Directions Forum people have applied for is the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. You might hear this referred to as the NARSAD. They tend to have a neuroscience focus and or genetics, and you have to have some sort of focus on mental health, mental illness that you're going to be studying. And you can see that it's a smaller dollar amount, and it's distributed over 2 years, but they are quite flexible in terms of how you want to spend that money, in terms of paying yourself or a project coordinator or grad student. So that can be a good opportunity. They fund about 25% of the awards that, of the applicants that they receive. So it sounds like a small amount, but it actually is quite high in terms of, you know, compared to other opportunities at NIH. The Jacobs Foundation is another place that you might consider applying. Typically now they are expecting people to be in a faculty position. So if you are still a grad student or transitioning to a postdoc, you might just keep this in your back pocket for something to think about down the road. They now offer just the Early Career Research Fellowship, which is about $150,000 distributed over 3 years. So again, good chunk of money to do some things with, lots of flexibility in how you spend that money. And then for me, I'm part of this program. One of the things I've really benefited from is the network that you join. So I've met a lot of really great other early career faculty members who are supported by the foundation. And that has led to some really interesting discussions about possible collaborations and just kind of getting to know people around the country. I know a lot less about the William T. Grant Foundation. Deb, have you ever applied for one?
No.
No. They have calls that vary from year to year. Currently, they have a proposal focused on reducing inequality that may be of interest to some of you. Budget for that application, I believe, ranges from $100K to $600K, depending on the scope of your project. And that call, I believe, will be around for a couple years. And they have another set of grants that they'll be funding that are focused on you know, better using research evidence and translating it into, you know, like actual changes in society or in mental health practice. So that might also be worth checking out. I have never applied for one of those. I don't, know if all WT Grant Foundation applications are like this, but a lot of them are 25 pages. Then, you know, as you know, with the NIH applications, they are max 12 pages. So it just seemed like a lot of work for not a lot of money. But it might be the right opportunity, and maybe I just need to be a little bit less, I don't know, I just need to write a little bit more. A few other opportunities here. Spencer Foundation might be relevant for some of you. You need to have a focus on childhood education. So depending on your work, that might be a good opportunity. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation also has a number of opportunities. They believe they have gotten rid of their postdoc program, but they do have a program for investigators that is all centered on building a culture of health. And some really creative projects are getting funded through that program. And I am less familiar with the other two on here. The Klingenstein Foundation has to have a neuroscience focus in the in your proposal, and then Kaplan Foundation for Early Childhood has to have an early childhood focus for sure. I believe the goal there is that you will, while your project might be locally focused, there's the possibility that the implications or the conclusions could be implemented nationwide. I believe Kate Humphreys has been supported by these last two if you have follow-up questions about that.
It looks like we only have about 5 minutes, so I can go through the review process pretty quickly.
Great.
So this is more for NIH grants, and we're focusing a little bit more on training grants right now. We have 5 areas with the training grants. 3 people review the applications. You get an overall score that is a summary across the 3 individuals. And then basically we go to meetings and we sit around for 2 days and we talk about the grants that have the top, the 50% highest ratings. First thing, research training plan. It's getting rated from 1 to 9. 1's the best. And these are just some areas that we want to see with the research training plan. So the significance, that you've done a thorough literature search. Like people will say, no one has ever looked at this particular topic, and then I'll often know, like, no, actually some people have looked at it. So when we're thinking about the innovation, we want to make sure that you're actually identifying a gap that needs to be addressed. How clear are your aims and hypotheses? Is the design appropriate? Is it feasible? Do you have the pilot data? Have you put together a power analysis? Is your analytic plan appropriate? And have you listed the paths not taken so that you've justified, this is why I'm doing this? And you might wonder, maybe I should do it this way. And we want to be able to say, I'm not doing it this way, and here's why. The training potential is the most important section. So I might give someone for the sponsor, the applicant, the institution, the research plan, I might give them a high score. If that training plan doesn't look good, I might give them a 6 on that. They're gonna get a 6 on the grant. Everything else could be a 1. The training piece really dictates what your final score is gonna be. So we're looking at feasibility. Sometimes people say, I have these 8 people and I'm gonna meet with them once a month. And I'm like, no, you're not. Like, that doesn't make sense. So we're thinking about the number of people, again, in terms of their contributions. Are these things that work together without having too much overlap? And again, we want those very specific details. Like I said, in section A of the bio sketch, in the training plan, in the letters of support, that it's clear, I'll meet with you. We don't want to just hear, I'll see them at a conference every year. That's not enough. We also don't want it to be overly ambitious, as I said. Want to make sure the training goes beyond what you already have in your advisors or your postdoc mentors lab, and that the training is going to help you accomplish the research plan. And we want to see different things, that you're taking classes, you're going to lab meetings, you're doing workshops. A lot of times people will say, I'm going to learn this statistical approach, I'm going to go to a training for a week, and then I'm going to be able to use it. And we know that when you go to that training, someone has to help you implement it in your project. So you can go to the workshop, but then you want to make sure that there's an individual there or as part of your sponsorship team that will ensure that you're able to implement what you've learned in the training. And then the institutional environment and commitment to training. Again, that's like, are you at a research institute that's going to support the work that you're doing? And then those other review criteria, we don't score them. We just want to make sure that they're adequate. Okay, and then these are some other areas that we have to score. But again, it's not, so with budget, like Katie was asking, you know, what ends up happening with that if we're giving someone a flat rate versus like a percentage. When we're looking at the budget, we're just like, yeah, that looks fine. And that's it. So it's not like anybody's looking at the budget very carefully. We're looking at the science.
I would just mention we are in the last minute here. So we'll post all of these slides. Lots of things to think about in terms of how many grants you want to be writing at any one time. But I know I don't want to make you late to your next session. So we'll make sure we have all of this available, and I'm happy to follow up with people one-on-one if they'd like to talk more about any of the topics we discussed today.
Yeah, me too. And our contact information is on the last slide.
Yeah, we'll make sure we have it there. Basically, what we didn't get a chance to talk about today is that get comfortable with rejection. Think about how much you want to juggle at any one time. More is not always better. But get lots of input from people, and also just trust your gut. So I know we have 30 seconds left before we lose you all. So
thank you so much, everybody, for being part of this. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and good luck. It's a tough grant world out there.